This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Very good to see you all on this cold day. We're very pleased to have one of our seminar conveners presenting today, John Stuart, who has been, he tells me, I'm shocked at the passage of time, he has been working at Kingston University for 10 years, and he's an associate professor of history there, teaching world history as well as British and imperial history. But of course, previously he was at King's College, where he did his PhD with Andrew Porter, and in 2011 published his, I'm in the wrong century, 2011, his book on British missionaries and the end of empire, East, Central and Southern Africa, 1939 to 1964, which looks at fascinating things like the Central African Federation and Seretse Khama marrying a white woman and apartheid and blah, blah, blah. But since then, John has been doing other work on missionaries in Africa, including some interesting work on British missionaries in Cairo, and we're hoping later in the year maybe to pick up some of those interests. But what we're looking at today is not British imperialism, but the sort of ending of Portuguese empire. So over to John to tell us about the improbable Diocese of Lebombo and what happened from 1961. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you all for coming. I must apologise, my voice is not in very good shape. If this was a singing engagement, I would have to cry off. But I'd like to begin by saying perhaps the obvious, that Africa in the early 1960s was in ferment for a variety of reasons. Yet to some extent it was also a period of some optimism. And it was a period of great interest in Africa. And one indication of that interest was the decision in 1962 of Penguin Books to start what it described as an African library under the general editorship of the South African-born activist Ronald Segal. And it was Segal who authored the first title in that series, African Profiles, in 1962. Over the course of the next dozen years or so, Penguin published 40 books in the series. Most of them, the vast majority of them, were written by Europeans, people with an interest in or knowledge of Africa. Some, as you can see here, were written by Africans. However, by the mid-1970s, the kind of interest that it has been possible to sustain in a publication of this sort was no longer possible, and Penguin decided to wind up the series. It has to be said that not only had interest perhaps waned, but other sources of information and opinion about Africa had grown up in the meantime. Nor was it as possible to be quite as optimistic about Africa's future as had been the case at the beginning of the 1960s. And in May 1975, Penguin published the final book, the 41st and final book in the series. The interesting thing about this book is that it was written by a missionary. And the man, when he wrote it, was no longer a missionary. He was a 48-year-old Anglican priest who was the rector of a Scottish Episcopal church near Kirkcudbright. And I'll go into the reasons why he wrote this particular book, but this was the book that got me interested, not only in Mozambique during this period, but in the history of Anglicans and Anglicans in Mozambique, because it's a subject about which very little, so far as I can tell, has been written. Some work has been done on church and mission in the early part of the 20th century, but little or nothing at all from the period after about the 1920s. Paul went to Africa in 1956 as a missionary of the university's mission to Central Africa, and he remained in Mozambique for 13 years, ending in December 1969. So he did not write the memoir until more than 5 years after he left. And the reasons he wrote it are not so much to do with a record of events as he recalled them during the time, but because of what happened in Mozambique after he left. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. I'll come on to the handout now, which is intended to spare me the task of going through a great deal of interesting but perhaps detailed information in relation to church mission and diocese. Because there are a couple of points I'd like to make at the outset. One, of course, is the period I'm looking at is part of a much longer period relating to the history of Anglicanism in Mozambique, which starts roughly in the 1890s and continues right on to the present day. And the second is to make some points about some of the organisations and the people to whom I'll be referring. This is a story really of mission and church, but also of diocese, and to some extent, briefly at least, of the Anglican communion itself, the way in which local church and mission affairs intersect with those of the communion in a more wide global sense. But it's also to think about the way in which events in Mozambique, to some extent influence, and are certainly influenced by, events in other countries. Most notably, of course, Portugal, to some extent Angola also, but South Africa, the UK, and Portugal as well. So for that reason, there are a lot of strands to this particular story. And it's at this point that I want to say, sorry, I'm going to flash over here for a moment, that this article, I beg your pardon, this paper is based on an article that will be published in Social Sciences and Missions, a journal published by Brill in spring of this year. So what I'm giving you are some edited highlights. And for information relating to this subject, I must thank Catherine Wakeling for her help in guiding me through the archives in relation to Mozambique and to the Anglican mission and church there. So what I'm going to do is to briefly refer to a couple of things in relation to this slide, dates and so on, and then move on from that. The diocese was formed as an extension, essentially, of the Church of the Province of South Africa in the 1890s, and it relied right from the outset, and has relied ever since, on support and encouragement from the United Kingdom. And it was for that purpose that the Lebombo Home Organisation, in a sense a predecessor of ALMA, was set up in the mid-1890s. And what you'll also find is that the role of the bishop in particular was particularly important, as was often the case in diocese supported by the SPG, as it was at this point in time. And one point I'll be making throughout the paper is the extent to which episcopal affairs have a considerable bearing on how Anglicanism is conducted, not only in terms of pastoral work, in terms of evangelization, but also in terms of what you might loosely call ecclesiastical diplomacy. Because in a way that was one of the responsibilities of the bishop, to represent the church to political authority, not just locally in Mozambique, but also in places such as Lisbon and London. And so for that reason, things of interest, things that occur in Mozambique, and to some extent in Angola as well, feed into other parts of southern Africa, and also indeed to parts of Europe as well. Now you see there's an enormous gap, which I'm not going to touch on, between the 1890s and more or less the 1950s. But one point I want to make at the outset is the relationship between the state in Portugal and the Roman Catholic Church, and in particular the Vatican. And that is formalised by a concordat, a diplomatic arrangement concluded in 1940, to which additions are made the following year in relation to mission. Ultimately, it means that the Portuguese authorities sanction Roman Catholic mission work. Most priests and most missionaries are Portuguese. Not all, it has to be said, but there's a very close alliance between church and state in that regard, and that obviously has implications for non-Roman missions, and the Anglicans are the ones I'm going to focus on particularly. So the next slide, the reason I've given you that bit of paper is because I'll be referring back to some of these points later on, and it'll save me having to wade through all this. So this obviously is a map of Mozambique, but it's so also it is a map of the Diocese of Lebombo, as it was during the period which I'm covering, because the diocese was coterminous with the country itself. There was only one diocese. There are now two. The diocese was made into two in 1980. And Mozambique, as you can see, is bordered by Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Swaziland. And those borders and those countries' affairs and relations with Mozambique obviously have a huge bearing on what goes on there, not only in relation to political affairs, but to an extent in relation to religious affairs also. I'll merely touch on some of those, and perhaps we can develop some of those points in the discussion. This is a variation on that map, and it's to emphasize two things to you. One, the capital, the location of the capital, Maputo, as it is now, Lourenço Marques, as it was then and until 1976. The other is the location, Mozambique, the mission to which John Paul went in 1956. And there are a couple of things I want to say about this map. One is to note the relative distance between the capital, the areas of influence and so on, and Mozambique itself. And also to point out to you that Mozambique is 3 times the size of the United Kingdom. It can't truly be said to be one country in a way. It's much more diverse than that. And in certain respects, the northeastern region where the Mozambique is located has as much, if not more, in common with parts of Tanzania and parts of Malawi than it does with other parts of Mozambique. In that respect, it's a bit of an unusual place. And the reason I want to emphasise that is because John Paul's book, his memoir, is about life at Mozambique. And because it is a very distinctive and, in some respects, quite influential book, it gives the impression that life at Mozambique was a fairly typical sort of affair of Anglican mission in Mozambique, when that was not really the case. There were many other missions throughout the rest of Mozambique, particularly in southern and south-central Mozambique. But John Paul's book, while it makes brief mention of this, it doesn't allow for its own distinctiveness in that right, and that's something that has to be borne in mind. One of the things I found out in relation to this book is that lots of people have cited it. In histories of the revolution, and particularly in histories of the church generally, in Mozambique during this period, you'll find it referenced, cited, occasionally quoted from, but I'm not sure if anyone's actually read it. And so in a sense this was my starting point in what is in the book, what does it say and why does it say what it says. And it quickly becomes apparent the more one looks into it and the more one studies the book alongside the archival record relating to church and diocese and mission, that it's a rather more complicated book. It is a memoir, and unashamedly so, and as a memoir, of course, it has lots of advantages and disadvantages going for it. What it leaves out is sometimes as interesting as what it puts in, but we can't always be clear how and why it does leave out certain things, and why it adopts a particular point of view in some respects. And that's a point to which I'll come back to, which is really a point about sources in general. Mozambique and Angola, of course, mattered a great deal to Portugal, and for that reason what happened there was of interest in Lisbon. I mean, that's summed up in this what I can only describe as a propaganda poster from about 1940, that Portugal is to some extent an imperial country, and its overseas possessions, although its relationship with the Maltese over time are very important to it, not merely in economic terms, but quite simply in terms of prestige and also in terms of identity. That's just a distinction worth knowing, because the sensitivity of the Portuguese to what goes on in their colonies is very pronounced, and nowhere more so than in relation to religious affairs. And it's in relation to those that I want to show you a further slide before I take a pause on that front, to note that when we talk about mission, be it Protestant or Roman Catholic, we always have to think about the kind of Protestants or Roman Catholics we're talking about. And I've referred briefly to the fact that the authorities sanction Roman Catholic activity, which means they make things difficult for non-Roman Catholic missions. But that within the Roman Catholic fraternity there are many variations. Not all of them are Portuguese, and not all of them share the attitude of Portuguese religious to the state as they do. Similarly, you have a variety, a complex variety of Protestant input. I could focus on many of these, and it's interesting that what has been written has tended to focus on the Swiss, the Methodists to some extent, and even to the American board in terms of its history during the early 20th century. There's a very good book about Campo Simongo in mid-central Mozambique. But again, Anglicans feature only briefly and only in passing. So I'm going to pause now and tell you a little bit more about what goes on. Once the mission is formed, the bishop begins to take a really leading role, typical of the way of missionary dioceses during the late 19th and early 20th century. And the most obvious example of this is Edward Smith, or Smythe, who's the first bishop. Very, very pioneering sort of man, but a man who takes his role as an ecclesiastical diplomat very seriously indeed, is constantly in touch with London, not only with Lambeth Palace and the Archbishop of Canterbury, but with the Foreign Office in London as well. He is an advocate of what he describes himself in the early 20th century as religious freedom, that is the right of Protestants as well as Catholics to proselytise, to set up schools and other institutions as well. And he is very aware of the extent to which, while Protestants are tolerated in Portuguese Africa, they're not granted the kind of concessions that would be the case for their Roman Catholic counterparts. I think, in a sense, the bishop's role in this respect has been focused on two things mostly: funds and friends. In other words, finding money for the diocese and making contact with people who will help to represent the interests of the diocese in the political arena. A good example of this occurs in 1911, when Smith finds himself in Lisbon, of all places, lobbying with the provisional Republican government there. There's briefly what I describe as a spasm of republicanism in Spain in the early 20th century. And he goes there on a mission to try and negotiate for fairer or more equal treatment of Protestants. He doesn't seem to have much success in that respect, because by the mid-1920s, the regime of Salazar and the Estado Nuevo has come into being, and the formalization of relationships between the state in Portugal and the Roman Catholic Church begins to take effect, and that culminates in the Concordat of 1940. Now, to give you an idea of the extent to which interest in Mozambique, but also in other parts of Portuguese Africa, feeds out into the wider world of mission and church, we might take the way in which Christians, as other humanitarians, are interested in Portuguese labour practices, in the extent to which those practices are exploitative, abusive, murderous to an extent, and the unease which this causes amongst Protestants. And famously or notoriously, the International Missionary Council, the ecumenical body of world Protestantism, covertly funds a study of Portuguese labour practices by an American sociologist whose very critical report, issued in 1925, draws down upon the Protestants the opprobrium of the authorities, not only in Rome's remarks, but in Lisbon as well. It is this kind of thing which winds up Anglican bishops. This, what they see as clumsy, publicity-minded interfering in affairs which might be better at least mediated, if not solved, through quiet diplomacy of the kind in which they believe themselves to be experts. And so for that reason, not only are the bishops of Lebombo rather wary of humanitarians and lobbying agencies such as that, they're equally wary of other Protestants. The extent to which those Protestants may try to work in an ecumenical way, Anglicans often regard this as being misguided. I'll give you a couple of quotes. These relate to the 1950s, in which one mission secretary describes in correspondence with the Archbishop of Canterbury at this time, Geoffrey Fisher, that it was to the advantage of the Church in Portuguese East Africa not to allow itself to be identified with what he described as a pan-Protestant bloc. It has to be borne in mind, he said, that the Anglican missions in Portuguese Africa are regarded much more favourably by the Portuguese than the other non-Roman missions. And here, the mission secretary, as indeed other missionaries and bishops, seems to regard as the high church practices of the mission, the university's mission, and also to an extent to the SPG, seemed in some sense closer to those of Rome than they did to those of Canterbury, Lambeth, or whatever. In other words, they always thought of themselves as exceptional in terms of who they were. Of course they were exceptional. They were English. They were Protestant. They weren't Catholic, but neither were they low church in that respect. So they constantly feel that they are people somehow with their finger on the pulse, with their connections with ecclesiastical authority, with the Foreign Office, consuls general in Mozambique, but also with civil servants in Lisbon as well, directly and indirectly. So we have this letter from the bishop in 1956. I am not happy in cooperation with other non-Roman missions. because they do not always seem to play fair with the civil authorities. In other words, they make life difficult for everyone else. Nevertheless, it's fair to say that the authorities do not really regard the Anglicans in a special light at all. This is something which the Anglicans think is the case, but it isn't really. Because as nationalism begins to grow in Angola, as also in Mozambique during the late 1950s, the church becomes, I beg your pardon, the state, the colonial authorities become increasingly suspicious of and indeed hostile to non-Roman Catholic missions. And it is in this context of growing hostility, but also growing nascent nationalism of the 1950s, that John Paul pitches up in Mozambique in December 1956. Now he arrives at Musumba, and what is apparent from his memoir is that Musumba is a wonderful place. It is remote, it is isolated. The people there are wonderful people because, in a sense, the world has left them behind to some extent. And for him, that part of Mozambique is a place which has a very distinctive aspect of Christianity to it. It's a place where the church can take root, but also, importantly, for someone connected to the university's mission, where old practices of hierarchy, of liturgy and so on can still be maintained without having to take heed of too many modernizing tendencies in the rest of the world. It has to be said, I judge from John Paul's writings a kind of almost proprietorial attitude towards the mission and towards the church. It is a little piece of Mozambique, which is also somehow almost a little piece of England. And of course it's not in an English or British colonial territory. Nevertheless, there are some peculiarities in terms of ecclesiastical boundary making upon which I need to touch very briefly. Because when John Paul arrives, Musumba is part of the Diocese of Nyasaland. It is not part of the Diocese of Lebombo. 3 years later, in a process too complicated to go into an ecclesiastical restructuring, primarily for financial reasons, the archdeaconry of which Musumba is part is brought into the Diocese of Lebombo, and therefore falls within the purview no longer of Central Africa but of South Africa, the Church of the Province, and under the stewardship, if you like, of the SPG from 1965, the USPG. All these things are occurring while John Paul is there. Much more importantly, however, is the development of nationalism into revolt, first in Angola in 1961, then 3 years later in Mozambique in late 1964. And because of its proximity to Tanzania, of course the nationalist movement Frelimo has been set up in Tanzania in 1962. Musumba becomes an area of revolt into which the Portuguese military move. An exclusion zone is created around the mission in order to provide a safe haven, essentially for refugees who are being driven from their homes as the military authorities try to clear the land of nationalists and nationalist sympathisers. Now, it is this activity, not only revolution, but refugee movement, which attracts the attention of people in the United Kingdom. And it also attracts the attention of the United Kingdom media, which sends correspondence to Southern Africa, including to Mozambique and including to Musumba. So in that way, Musumba begins to enter the consciousness of the public in quite a unique way. And it also places John Paul in a very distinctive position. He is, by this stage, and has been since 1958, the missionary in charge. He is the governor, as it were, in that respect. He has a small team in the early 1960s of 8 African priests and deacons to help serve him. But nevertheless, he is, in a sense, running the mission with its associated institutions, hospital, schools, and so on, in a sense, in a very distinctive entity. Now, the remoteness, as I suggested from the map earlier, is a problem for the diocese itself, because Musumba is an enormously long way from the capital, Lourenço, which is also the place of residence of the bishop. Now, the bishop at this time was a man named Stanley Picard, whose name is more or less lost to history. Nevertheless, Picard had been a missionary at Musumba prior to John Paul's arrival there. he was a very dedicated and diligent man, but also a man who was probably not well suited to the kind of conditions in which the diocese found itself in the early 1960s. In other words, in a revolutionary environment in which the attitude of the authorities towards religious organisations, especially if they're non-Catholic, becomes ever more hostile. Pickard decides that he cannot continue as bishop, and it will be necessary to find a successor. And here we touch on the issue of ecclesiastical leadership, which of course is also exercising the minds of Anglican bishops and leaders of other Protestant denominations right across sub-Saharan Africa at this point in time, as political evolution is taking place, however belatedly in relation to Portugal, so also is it taking place in relation to British Africa. But who should succeed Pickard? Another English bishop? There have been 8 so far since the diocese was instituted in the 1890s. An African? There is no hope of that, because no African has risen to the rank even of archdeacon at this point in time. There has been no investment in their training or development in that respect. So there is a need to look more widely. And it is in that context that we have to briefly consider the Anglican Communion. Because in 1958, in the Lambeth Conference of that year, Anglicans begin to pay greater attention to the way in which political and other developments in the non-Western world are complicating the role of the Church. It's a problem to some extent that Anglicanism is so closely connected with England and with the Church of England. So as the complexity of Anglican needs to find fuller form in terms of leadership, which is not only non-English but non-European, how does the Church adapt to that? There are all sorts of discussions in the early 1960s. There's an initiative instituted by an influential American bishop, Stephen Bain, Mutual Responsibility and Interdependence. This is the kind of context in which the communion, which is becoming more heterogeneous, more complicated, is trying to retain a sense of unity in all sorts of ways. And so it is in that context that the succession of the Bishop of Lebombo comes under scrutiny, not just in Mozambique, not just in Cape Town, not just in London, but more widely as well. So it is felt that perhaps the Church should look elsewhere, outside Africa, but also outside England for its leadership. The most obvious place to look is somewhere you might not immediately think of. It's the Episcopal Church of Brazil, which has been made an associate member of the Anglican Communion in the early 1960s, and of course there is a relationship in terms of language and culture. It doesn't prove possible, however, for anything to come of that. So the Anglicans turn their attention to Portugal and to an institution known as the Lusitanian Church, which is the Anglican Church within Portugal and Spain. And there they find their new bishop. And this is him. His name is Daniel de Pina Cabral, and he is a lawyer by profession, which is in a way quite unusual. He's about 42 years old, he's a native of Oporto, he's married, he has 4 children, and he is also a priest. After some negotiating, Cabral agrees to become firstly an assistant bishop, with the idea then that he will succeed the existing bishop as soon as he decides to hand over the reins. And this arrangement takes place in 1967-68. The enthronement takes place at St. Paul's Church in Lisbon. It's attended by many dignitaries, English, Portuguese, but also of other nationalities from the broader Anglican family or Anglican communion. It really is a remarkable event. You have a succession of an English bishop by a non-English, strictly speaking, non-Anglican bishop. The only equivalent thing I can think of is the Gobat succession, which of course is in Jerusalem before the creation of the Anglican Communion in the 1860s. But for Cabral, this is a step into the unknown, but it's also a step into the unknown for the diocese. Neither have had much to do with each other, and this becomes, in some respects, quite a difficult process of transition. Nevertheless, Cabral brings to his job a reforming zeal. He is the man who makes this quote when he begins to reflect on what he's taken on in the summer of 1968. Describing what he describes as the most improbable diocese of the Anglican Communion, he reflected ruefully on its continuing reliance on support from the United Kingdom. Our Christians, he said, do not feel that their church is their own, but rather that they belong to and are the beneficiaries of a rich, in inverted commas, Anglican mission. They show no signs of realizing that they have to support the work of the diocese. They have, in a sense, allowed themselves to become dependent upon an external agency, the mission and the Lebombo home organisation in the UK. And it is to try and work around this that Cabral begins to develop links with other churches outside Africa, most notably with the Episcopal Church in Brazil. And he recruits, indeed, two Anglican priests from Brazil to work in Mozambique. But he also goes on fundraising tours, not only to Portugal, but also to Europe and to the UK, and subsequently also to the United States as well. He's performing the kind of role that Anglican bishops have always performed since the inception of the diocese, but he's performing it in a very much wider context, because he does not want to remain reliant on that link with the United Kingdom. Why not? Because of the complexity of relationships between Portugal, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. Cabral is in a rather difficult position because, of course, he is Portuguese. And Mozambique is, to all intents and purposes, a Portuguese colony. It's not really a colony, the relationship is a little more complicated than that. But nevertheless, it raises questions in the minds of some people, and certainly in the minds of John Paul, as to where the new bishop's loyalties lie. This forms an important aspect of John Paul's memoir, the extent to which the bishop is truly able, by virtue of his nationality, to work in the interests of the people of Mozambique. Might he have some residual, some latent sympathy for the Portuguese, even some loyalty to them? It has to be said that that is doubtful, because John Paul surely knows that the bishop in his youth was a critic of the Salazar regime, a quite outspoken critic in that respect, as indeed were some other clergy and professionals as well. But nevertheless, given the position in which the Anglican Church finds itself and the complexity of mission church affairs as the revolution takes hold in the mid-1960s, this becomes a very difficult problem. Why? Because as the revolt continues, the Church begins to crack down on non-Roman Catholic missions. Thereby it creates not only dissent amongst Protestants, but also amongst Roman Catholic religious as well. The extent to which this becomes apparent occurs really in the early 1970s. And I want to speak now about perhaps the most controversial aspect of the revolution during the early 1970s, which occurs after John Paul has left Mozambique in late 1969, returned to Britain and become a parish priest in Kirkcudbright. You'll see from your chronology there that in 1972, Portuguese military carries out a massacre of civilians in a place called Wiriamu in central Mozambique. This is hushed up, to cut a long story short, but news about it leaks out, and that news is made available primarily to the outside world by priests of the Burgos Fathers. And the Burgos Fathers, as their name implies, is a Spanish religious agency, not a religious order as such, because these are secular priests. They don't have affiliation with a particular order. They come from a particular part of north-central Spain. But they are people who identify very closely not only with African people, but with African nationalism as well. And this is another very, very complicating factor in terms of church-state relationships. The Burgos Fathers are aghast at what has happened. They are critical of the supine attitude of the Roman Catholic hierarchy within Mozambique. already the White Fathers, the missionaries of Africa, have made their displeasure known in mid-1971 by deciding to withdraw from Mozambique. And of course, the priests of the White Fathers are mostly Spanish, also some Italians as well, but they're not Portuguese. But the greatest publicity which is accorded this particular episode which at Wiriamu is created by Adrian Hastings, the former missionary and Catholic priest who is currently in Britain. He makes known to the London Times in July 1973 the information that has been provided to him by two Spanish priests of the Bocas Fathers. The Times splashes this story in a big way on the eve of an official visit to the United Kingdom by Caetano Salazar's successor as Portuguese Prime Minister. There's an enormous amount of controversy about it, and what I want to touch on, this story is fairly well known, but it's been looked at again by Mustafa Dada, who's researched this work for a long time and has just published a book with Bloomsbury on its subject, on the subject of the massacre. This is to give you an idea of Wiriamu. It's a very much disputed event, but there can be no question that it actually took place. It's believed that about 400 people were killed in cold blood. Comparisons were made with My Lai and things like that. And a storm of criticism descends on the Portuguese, threatening briefly the relationship between Portugal and the United Kingdom, but only briefly, it has to be said. Portugal and the United Kingdom have a fairly long established and indeed valuable relationship. What I'm most interested in is the reaction of the Anglican Church to this, because the Roman Catholics are outspoken in their criticism. Cabral is confronted with this as bishop. What does he make of it? He doesn't believe it. In fact, he believes that Hastings is stirring the brown stuff for political reasons, and he is not slow to say this. And he has no evidence for this. As far as he can tell, his Roman Catholic contacts have no knowledge of it. He believes this is being undertaken not only for political ends, but in order to discredit the Portuguese in terms of the relationship not only between Portugal and Mozambique, but between Portugal and the United Kingdom. The other thing that has to be said, what the Wiriamu controversy does, is it stimulates John Paul to write his memoir. That is the reason he writes the book, because he wants to give his version, not of Wiriamu, because it has had nothing to do with him, but his story of what happened at Lembombo between the years that he was there in 1956 and 1959. And in the book he goes into some detail about the extent to which it is difficult for a missionary, for any missionary, but perhaps all for an Anglican, or perhaps mostly for an Anglican missionary who is also English, to create to make a very critical protest against the Portuguese authority. Why? Not because of any lack of fear on his account, but because of what it may bring down on other missionaries and above all on the native people of Mozambique itself. His aim throughout is to work closely with the authorities to try and make things work as well as possible. His sympathies are with Frelimo. I'll show you a quote at the end as to how he expresses this later. But because his sympathies are with Frelimo and he's becoming more critical in absence of the Portuguese state, he's also more critical of Cabral, who, as we've just seen, has failed to react as John Paul would wish him to do. Why? Because Cabral wants to continue in the vein of Anglican missions of the past. This is the really very striking thing about the succession by a Portuguese bishop to what has always been an English diocese in effect in terms of its leadership. Officials of the SPG who make visits to southern Africa sometimes reflect rather disparagingly, and it has to be said rather patronisingly, on the difficulty that the Mozambicans are having to adapt to this guy after decades of English episcopal rule, and the extent to which it's not really what they're used to. But what becomes apparent the more one looks into it is the extent to which Cabral is perhaps more English than the English themselves, at least in terms of liturgy, at least in terms of his commitment to a Catholic view of the Church, to his view of the involvement, however gradual, of Africans in it, and of course his willingness to work in a diplomatic way with political authority. John Paul expected Cabral to be outspokenly critical. He was really expecting him to act in a way which he wasn't capable of acting himself. He's being, in a sense, inconsistent in his argument in that way. The reason that Cabral behaved the way he did was not because he was Portuguese, but because he was Bishop of Lebombo. And that was how bishops of Lebombo had always acted, in a sense, because that was how they had to act. They had an opportunity, indeed, to make the most of their theological outlook and in terms of their relationship with the Church, but also to put it in particular terms. As you can see, I'm hunting very unsuccessfully for a quote here. But it's really very striking to see Cabral emphasize, as previous English bishops had done, the connection or the closeness of the Anglican Church in Mozambique with the Roman Catholic Church. He, for instance, writes to the superior of the Community of the Resurrection on one of his endless quests for more money or for more priests, to make this very point, because of course the community has long since sent priests to Johannesburg, and Cabral believes why not send them to Mozambique as well. In any case, I think I'm pretty unable to find this. Oh, here it is, yes. No, anyway, I haven't found it. Sorry about that. In any case, John Paul pitches into the controversy about Wiriama through his book, through his memoir, sometime after Hastings has brought this to light. There's a photograph here of just how public this had become and who Hastings was enlisting to his cause. The former Hugh Foote, who had been Britain's representative at the UN and a very notable diplomat, but also Mário Soares, the Portuguese socialist leader, and so on. Hastings is unashamedly politicising this issue because he feels it is the only way in which things are going to be done. But other things are also happening in terms of the World Council of Churches and its combat racism policy. The extent in a way in which everyone apart from the Anglican Church, it seems, is trying to bring attention to bear on the problems of Mozambique in relation to race and also in relation to Portuguese colonial violence. Ultimately, the strain of all of this proves too much for Cabral. By 1976, he has concluded that he can no longer continue. Nevertheless, he has made quite a difference in terms of setting up his succession by an African bishop, by Denis Singulain, who becomes the first African-born Mozambique bishop of Lebombo in Mozambique in 1976. And for that reason, I've been trying to focus attention on the extent to which the usual complexities and ambiguities of Anglican mission in Africa during a period not only of decolonization but also of revolution become very apparent in the case of Mozambique. And also to draw attention to the fact that the complexity of those affairs, which of course continue after the Wiriama controversy and into the post-independence era, a period of civil war in Mozambique, but a period also of continuity in relation to Anglican affairs. And this, in a sense, is where we return to where we began, because Singulain remains bishop for an unprecedented 38 years until he retires. He became bishop at a very, very young age until he retired in 2014. So John Paul continues to maintain an interest in African affairs, and particularly in terms of those in Mozambique. He becomes very supportive of Adrian Hastings in his drive to draw attention to the evils of Portuguese colonialism. John Paul becomes, in a sense, quite famous in some respects. His book sells, despite The Misgivings of Penguin, about 3,000 or 4,000 copies, which is not too bad. He gets invited to East Berlin, of all places, and accepts to give a talk about anti-imperialism. And he concludes his talk, at least according to the transcript, with the words "Viva Frelimo." In a sense, he is being carried along in a way that was not possible for him to be carried along during his period as a missionary. This is a point he keeps coming back to in his memoir. If only, I hadn't been so tied up with the mission. If only so many people weren't reliant on me, I would have really acted like Adrian Hastings. We can't honestly be quite sure about that. But the fact is that he is critical of Cabral, as I've suggested, I think in a rather disingenuous way. However, the criticism of Cabral is not all that well received in some circles, especially amongst those who are old hands of the Diocese of Lebombo, because many people recognise Cabral for what he was, a decent and honourable man trying to do a difficult job. And his criticism, which comes out in the book, becomes the source of some comment amongst some missionaries and former missionaries. One of those suggested that the book displayed the English tendency to think that no good can come from outside these islands, that is the United Kingdom. It is strange how we seem to despise the Portuguese. Others took a different, if still more critical view. Basil Davidson, whose name you saw on one of those titles on one of the slides, reviewed the book after it came out. He praised it as moving and illuminating, and he commended John Paul's honesty and courage. But he noted, however, that his criticism of Portugal came rather late. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that the most outspoken, the most timely, and the most influential criticism of Mozambique, of Portugal ruling in Mozambique, did not come from John Paul or from Cabral. It came from the White Fathers in 1971, from the Burgess Fathers in 1973, and of course from Adrian Hastings. Many others pitched in. Trevor Huddleston is another example of this. Anyway, by 2009, and which is when I picked up this particular story, when I was contributing to a conference on it, John Paul had made several subsequent visits back to Mozambique, and he was in touch with the successor organisation, as I said, the Mozambican Anglican Association, and he was interviewed by an ecumenical news agency, and this is what he said. This is what he was quoted as saying. If I had been a young African in the 1960s, I would have joined Frelimo and supported it throughout the struggle for freedom. It wasn't possible for him to do that. He wasn't African. He perhaps sympathised with them, but because his memoir is written retrospectively, and because it has to some extent an agenda of a sort, I think it's necessary to look at it in a broader context. The context not only of what happened in Musumba, but also what happened in Mozambique more widely, but also what happened in South Africa, Portugal, and of course the United Kingdom. So thank you very much.